In our last class, we talked about the golden age of comics, that first generation where anything could possibly happen. We focused mainly on the superhero aspect of it, which was huge from 1938 to the 1940s with the end of World War II. Following World War II, with the superhero on decline, other genres actually picked up. Let's take a look at those. One of the biggest genres was teen comics, which actually came out of the superhero genre. You might say that the first teen comics might be those sidekicks, like the Cub Commandos coming out and being the heroes, but those are still adventures. What we're going to look at with teen comics is actual drama and comedy. Those originated with Pep Comics, and they had their superhero, the Shield, who would go around as this FBI agent who gained superpowers and wore looks like a really uncomfortable costume, but beat up the bad guys. Of course, by World War II, he was fighting Nazis in the Japanese Empire. And in issue number 41, in 1943, we had a really special issue about the home front. So Pep Comics kind of turned its attention to drawing these teenage audiences, in which case they focused on this character Archie and his good friend Jughead there in the town of Riverdale. And the story was Archie and Jughead kind of depressed because they wanted to fight in the war effort, but they weren't old enough, and what could they do to help? And the Shield appears in a dream and tells them that they can, they can plant victory gardens and hold aluminum drives and things like that. And people really liked it because it had Archie in it. So, even within just 4 more issues, now we have Pep Comics starring Archie Andrews, and the Shield's way in the back. Instead, in the forefront, we have Archie and his good friends, Jughead, of course, and Betty and Veronica, which this would begin the decades-long question of, will Archie go on to date Betty, the friendly girl next door who can fix a truck, or Veronica, the rich girl? And that is a question that will never be answered because it continues to sell comics to this day. Eventually, Pep Comics would reform itself into Archie Comics, and they would focus strictly on this teenage audience. The comics for decades would be quick jokes and fun stuff like that, just adventures. And through the decades, Archie would expand into several different universes, having different plot lines. And here in the 90s, we've even gotten into a new horror genre. So we have Archie Comics where Jughead's a werewolf, and that's why he has this insatiable hunger, which was always a point of comedy in the comics. We have one where Veronica's a vampire. We have a zombie apocalypse there in Riverdale. So a lot of different directions for it. In fact, they even killed off Archie in one of the comics lines. He sacrificed himself, saving a senator from an assassin. So Archie's gone in a lot of different directions, but maintains that question of teenage relationships as just kind of the forefront of what's going on with young folks. And that maintains a very strong audience that often gets overlooked when we're talking about comics and mainly focus on the superheroes. The biggest comics audience were, of course, kids. I mean, adults were buying certain things too. But this Harvey Comics had about half the market share for who was buying comics. So they got started with their headliner, Casper, which came out in 1939 as a children's book, and then later Paramount turned it into an animated feature, these ghost who wants to be friends with people, but has inherent drama because people are afraid of him. Well, that did well enough that while comics were looking for more directions, they gave up on their superheroes and started focusing on these kids. And Casper turned into Richie Rich, the poor little rich boy. So Richie Rich is having all kinds of adventures based on having this crazy amount of money and people trying to steal his money or going on adventures to get more money and helping folks and all kinds of just really easy kiddie things. Such as quick gags like having your palm read in it and having a dollar sign on it. They also had Wendy, the good little witch, and I think that summarizes the kids' aspect of this pretty well. She's a witch, but she uses her powers for goodness and niceness, and here she is flying on a vacuum cleaner because, it's not a broomstick, it's a modern broomstick. And, it's cute, it's fun, and that's really all you need. Meanwhile, comics were taking a different direction under the company that had been started by Max Gaines, the one who had basically invented comics back in the 1930s. So, after listening to Will Marston about kids learning through comics, he really dedicated himself to that idea. Eventually, he would sell off his all-American comics with Green Lantern and Flash and characters like that to DC, and that's how Green Lantern and Wonder Woman became DC characters. And he focused it on his educational comics, EC. They had titles like Picture Stories from Science, or Picture Stories from History, or Picture Stories from the Bible, and these really non-fictional education books. They were purchased fairly okay. Stuff like your aunt would buy you, which, hey, you like comics, don't you? Here you go. And you'd say thank you and, look through it, but really you just want a Superman comic. So that kind of faltered back and forth. And then in 1947, Max Gaines passed away, and his son Will Gaines took over. Which Will Gaines, here a very fun-loving guy, he literally grew up with comics. When he was a teenager, he started working at his father's comics warehouse, loading boxes and carrying things, and got editorial work and lettering, and was eventually, inherited the editorship. And nobody really blamed him for it. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he did keep his father's educational comics going. The rumor was he was still a little afraid of him even after he passed away. But he needed new directions to really keep the company solvent. And so he changed it around to being entertaining comics, keeping the EC, but needing to do something else with it. He started thinking about older people who read comics like himself. They really grew up with it, but now they don't want to read about Casper the Ghost or another superhero. They want something more adult. And so he came up with picto-fiction, this idea of it not being a comic book, but adult crime stories, illustrated, right? Costing $0.25, so 25 cents is a serious step up from 10 cents, which you'd be paying on a Superman or Batman comic. And it's pretty lurid. We have a guy bursting in with a gun. We have the lady with the strap of her gown over her shoulder. What's going to happen? Well, you got to be a grown-up and you got to pay 25 cents to find out. And turned out people liked it. There had been a lot of people who had grown up on comics. During World War II, when you were in the service, you got your care packages, a pack of cigarettes, a chocolate bar, and a comic book. And so now these veterans had a chance to come back and read comics, and it blew up. So crime stories were a big one, as well as horror. So Tales from the Crypt really took off. And here we have this kind of zombie werewolf walking through the moors and are going to attack this guy. And that looks pretty spooky. And you want to find out what's going to happen. And they would do these anthology stories, really creepy stuff, often tied to moral tales. So they'd have things like family who's trying to inherit a bunch of money from their great aunt who just keeps on living, and they got to bump her off, and so they cook her a birthday cake and put poison in it, so when she eats it she passes away, and as they're celebrating afterward, they find cake and start eating it and realize that it's the same cake, and so they all get poisoned and die because of their greed. Here's another example, The Haunt of Fear. So people were eating up this horror so fast that they came up with different titles for it. Even young Stevie King up in Maine would spend his lawn mowing money buying these comics and reading about horror and eventually going on to write horror. So this story is about a guy who is paying money to collect these specimens from all over the world, and has this guy who swears up and down that he's collecting it legitimately, and turns out he's a bad guy. And so he has delivered a package in which this fellow who is going out and getting him all of his prizes from international territories turned out to be a victim himself, and was turned into a shrunken head and delivered. So really creepy, fun stuff. Here's another, The Vault of Horror, which each of these were introduced by the Vault Keeper, the Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch. These really kind of scary frame narratives that could give us a little bit more commentary on the moral aspect of it. which was a lot of the argument for, well, how can you sell these really scary stories? And like, well, they all have a moral message to them. It's a good thing they're there. Going back different directions, not only horror, but the crime was very popular. They had action, a lot of World War II stories, in fact, even true stories coming up, as well as a whole bunch of sci-fi and fantasy stories. Those were really popular. In fact, a lot of Ray Bradbury's stories, especially from the Martian Chronicles, became comics for entertaining comics. They accidentally produced one. It was a little very similar to the short story, and there was some mix-up with the adaptation rights. And he found out about it through a reporter calling him up saying, hey, I saw you had a comic in there. What do you think about that? And he said, well, that's very interesting, but I haven't gotten my royalty check yet. Which some people, might take it to court and argue, but Will Gaines was a businessman. It was very popular, and so he called him up, and he apologized and said, we'll get a check to you immediately, and all about. And by the way, do you have any other stories for it? And, of course, being a writer, he had tons of stories and created this partnership that kept going for the rest of the company's history, which unfortunately was cut short by this guy. So, in 1954, this fellow here, Dr. Frederick Wortham, he was working as the chief psychologist at Bellevue Hospital for Children, and taking a look at all these kids who had really serious problems, and noted that they all read comic books. So he discerned that it was these comic books that were causing all of these mental illnesses, which kids like comics, so probably not logically bound, but it was a pretty shocking idea, and very much was eaten up by people who liked this. So he wrote Seduction of the Innocent, this idea that children are being corrupted and we have to do something to stop them. Which, of course, this happens every generation. The generation before this, movies were corrupting kids, right? That's why we had the Hays Code come in and give us ratings on who could go see what. A couple of generations afterward, it'd be rap music that's melting kids' minds, and so they've got to put stickers on it to protect the kids. Now, every couple of years, they talk about how video games are ruining kids' minds, and now TikTok is going to have all the kids brainwashed so that they join communist China. So a lot of fear-mongering, but a lot of people do buy into it, and people started freaking out, and they were reading these comics, mainly from EC, these kind of adult-oriented comics, showing pretty shocking stuff, which, here's a panel that's pulled from the book. We'll drain this Dane dry. Yeah, she'd squeal if we left her enough blood to recover. So we have these clearly bad guys, because they've got their eyes shaded, stealing blood to put it on the black market. Which the caption reads, outside the forbidden pages of Desaad, we find draining a girl's blood only in children's comics, which does have a problem since all of those adult crime stories are for adults. They're not children's comics. It's this big misconstrual. But people were panicking about it, and they ended up having a congressional hearing, and they brought in Will Gaines and said, hey, are you doing these comics? And he said, yes. And they said, well, why are you letting them get into children's hands? And he said, I'm not. I'm just putting them on the newsstands. Why are their parents allowing them to get into children's hands? Like, shouldn't they be involved in their kids' lives? Which, of course, is not what the parents wanted to hear. They just wanted to blame somebody. And so they got into deeper things, and, they'd hold up a comic cover, and they'd say, is this an appropriate horror comic cover? And it'd have something like a guy holding up a skull, and he'd said, well, it's appropriate for a horror comic. If it'd be inappropriate, it'd be like dripping in blood and have a spinal cord attached to it and all this horrible stuff, which Will Gaines was just joking, but the senators weren't. And so finally they, told the comics industry, police yourselves, otherwise we'll do it for you. And so they came out with the Comics Code. And this idea of a Comics Code Authority, CCA, in 1955, gave a huge list on what you can and cannot do in comics. So no blood, stealing, of course, no crime being glorified. You can't show people being using guns unless they're bad people and those guns aren't discharged. no blood, no vampires, no ghosts, no werewolves, no black magic, like everything that is really selling for entertaining comics. Which initially, Will Gaines said, fine, that's the new rules, and we'll shelve all the Tales from the Crypt lines and so forth, and we'll focus on the science fiction. That's been going pretty well. Then came Judgment Day, which was a comic that was so shocking, it ended up shutting down the entire company. It's here for you to read, but spoiler, it's about an astronaut from Earth coming to this world of robotic peoples. We have the yellow robots and the blue robots, which the yellow robots are treated very well, and the blue robots are kept down as second-class citizens, clearly talking about segregation there in the 1950s. And they promised all this technology from Earth, but the humans say that the robots clearly aren't ready because they are separating themselves on such trivial things. And when they are ready, they can join the Great Galactic Republic. And as the astronaut's leaving, he takes off his helmet, and it turns out to be black. And there's a really glorious panel showing him staring up at the skies and his beads of sweat glimmering like stars. It's really cool. But people in 1955 weren't ready for it. And so they sent the script in to get approved by the Comics Code Authority. Got approved, no problem. They weren't really paying attention to it. They sent the art in, it came back, and they said, you can't publish this. They can't give a seal of approval for it. And Will Gaines called him up and said, well, why not? The editor over at the Comics Code Authority said, well, you know why not. And he said, no, I want you to tell me specifically why not. And they hummed and hawed for a while, but basically it boiled down to, it's going to cause problems. And he'd say, well, maybe we need to move forward with this. Maybe that's a problem that needs to be resolved. And they hummed and hawed and said, well, I'm not racist, but these other people and so forth. And finally, well, if you're not racist, what can I do? And he said, well, you can publish the comic. So they hummed and hawed around for a while and finally decided, okay, well, we could publish it. It just can't be a black astronaut. And he said, well, that's unacceptable. That's the point of the story. And finally fought him back and forth and said, okay, well, it can be a black astronaut. Just, take that beads of sweat off on him because you don't want him to put it on a pedestal. And Will Gaines flipped out. He said a lot of words that you're not allowed to say under the Comics Code Authority and slammed the phone down reportedly so hard that he broke it. So he decided, well, I'm going to publish this anyway, and he did, but it didn't have that Comics Code Authority seal of approval, and so nobody would pick it up. None of the grocery stores would carry it, none of the newsstands would carry it, and Will Gaines said, that's enough, I'm done, and shut down entertaining comics. He did keep one part of the business going, a little magazine called Mad, which we'll talk about in a future weeks, but this kind of restrictions by the CCA is what's going to end the golden age of comics. And next class, we'll take a look at the next era where superheroes come back strong.